everyone, and thank you for joining me again for yet another amazing discussion with somebody that I value tremendously. And I'm so grateful that Miss Rueanna Haynes, a fellow Trinidadian, is here to join me for this discussion. And in a minute, I'll let her introduce herself. But before we get into that, the reason we're here and the topic we're discussing today is the fact that on the 23rd of July this year, the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, delivered a landmark opinion on the obligation of states regarding the climate crisis. And this was spearheaded by a country very dear to me, Vanuatu, which is the most at risk country to natural disasters on Earth. And so this is what we're here to talk about today. And this is what Ruana is going to tell us all about. Ruana, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Mala. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to see you. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here to contribute to this discussion in any way. Um, Maybe I'll start by introducing myself
Yes,
for
please
your
tell us who you
audience.
are, what you do, what keeps you up at night, that kind of thing.
That list on what keeps me up at night is long, so maybe I'll abbreviate it. But yeah, so my name is Ruana Haynes. At present, I am the Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean and the Head of Diplomacy for Climate Analytics Global as an organization. And I have been working in the climate change field for the past 15 years, maybe a little bit more. And I've played various roles in that time. I began my career as a Trinidad and Tobago diplomat, serving in the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs as it was at that time, and then being posted out to the permanent mission in New York, where I followed a number of issues, including sustainable development and climate change. And so I would have been around when, as an international community, we were working on the UN Sustainable Development Goals as well as the Paris Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And these days, primarily, I'm involved in, I guess, shaping the direction of my organization as it relates to our engagement in the diplomatic process, as well as working with the Caribbean office or Caribbean team, trying to really connect the dots between the international discussion and what we see happening and what we understand about this issue on the ground in the region. So, Climate Analytics is a climate policy institute, at least that's how it started, working in a number of different areas, really focused on, um, I guess, bringing a better understanding of climate science
Mm-hmm.
into the global policy discussion and using science increasingly in the service of climate justice and in the service of those who are most vulnerable.
Nice. Thank you for that. And I first met you some years ago. It was before COVID.
Just
Um,
before.
yes, it was at a conference in Bahamas and Cayman for RF Bank and Trust, and I'm on their board. And I was so pleased to see a fellow Trinidadian on stage. And what struck me about the presentation that you delivered was how
Mhm.
real this issue was. And I
Yeah,
think a lot of people, we get on our daily lives and not really pay attention to the fact that the planet is in a crisis. Um,
exactly.
and so your presentation really drove that point home to me, and it has stuck with me. What, maybe 6 years ago, since that presentation. And so I'm very honored and pleased that you're here with me now having this discussion. Tell us about this landmark opinion delivered by the ICJ in July, how it came about, um, and what does it mean? What was your role in it as well?
Mhm. Well, maybe I'll start with a disclaimer first. I would say my
Yes.
role in it was very tangential, especially in terms of um, in the early stages of where it began. I came in more into the process when the question was already before the court and the states were making submissions. I supported um, some brilliant regional lawyers in their work putting together some of those submissions and then in responding to questions that were posed by the court. But that's sort of very much towards the end of the process in 2024. There was a very long road before that.
Hmm.
And, I feel as though it's not my story to tell, but I do know the story. So I will share what I know of it with you.
Okay, great.
So this
Thank you.
started with students in Vanuatu.
Hmm.
So students involved in climate activism and climate justice issues. Based in Vanuatu, but also I understand including students from around the Pacific Small Island
Yes.
Developing State region. So it's a group of
Yes.
students that had this idea um, that they could possibly help to strengthen the legal basis for climate action by posing a question to the International Court of Justice that would encourage them to clarify the rights and duties and obligations around climate change, the rights, duties, and obligations of states as it pertains to climate action. And this
Could I just
effort,
interrupt you there? I
yeah,
just want to interrupt you there to emphasize the point to our listeners that it was a bunch of students that did
hmm
this. And so I want to make sure it is clear that none of us should ever feel that we are too small, we are too young, we are too insignificant to make a difference. These very young people in a very remote part of the world, in very vulnerable societies, came together and did this, and it's a historic occasion. And I just want to say that and emphasize that so nobody could ever feel that they can't do big things.
exactly. And I'm glad you
Mhm.
say that because that's a question that I get a lot. What do you feel that as a young person I can do? Um, and it's very clear the sky is the limit,
Mhm.
as we have seen now. And so i- this initiative was then taken forward, taken up by the government of Vanuatu that agreed to bring the issue to the UN General Assembly. So it's important to say that there's a lot of formality around the procedures and the operation of the International Court of Justice, right? It
Mhm.
is, yes, the world's highest court established under the Charter of the United Nations. And
Mhm.
based on the rules of procedure for how the court will operate, it is possible to pose a question to the court requesting an advisory opinion, but only certain entities are allowed to do so, and individual states are not allowed to do so necessarily. And
Okay.
so, in order to have these questions posed to the ICJ, Vanuatu had to go through the UN General Assembly, which is one of a few organs that is allowed to pose a question to the ICJ for an advisory
Mm.
opinion. And
Okay.
so, it's important to say that this was always going to be an uphill battle. It is not
Mhm.
the first time that a small island developing state tried to get support for a question to be posed to the International Court of Justice, right?
Mm.
Requested an advisory opinion. It was tried before in the past, I believe, by Tuvalu, and that effort was defeated. Now,
Hmm.
there are 193, 94 odd members, states of the UN General Assembly.
Mhm.
And in order for a question to go to the ICJ, unanimity is not required, but you do need, I believe, a two-thirds majority.
Right.
And for many states in the consultations leading up to the submission of the question, if they get the impression that they will not have a critical majority, or that some states would vote against it, vote it down. They will choose to voluntarily drop the
Withdraw
matter,
it. Hmm. Okay.
withdraw it.
Okay.
So it's worth noting in this context that Vanuatu was able to lead um, the consultation process to further refine and develop the questions and get to a point where the questions were posed to the ICJ by consensus. So there was no state that objected to these questions being posed. And that in itself was a diplomatic feat to get to
It's an
that point.
accomplishment for sure.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Thank you for
Um,
that context.
to get the question into the court. And so that was only the first hurdle in the process. So
Hmm.
the questions go to the court. The court has to agree that they have jurisdiction to respond to the questions that are posed.
Hmm.
That hurdle was crossed. And then comes the invitation for states to make written submissions. This was followed up by an invitation for states to make oral presentations to the court, um, which happened in December last year. There was an open hearing for oral submissions to be made to the court, and this was then followed up by the court posing some follow up questions for responses from parties early this year. So, this is a multi year process that began, as you said, in a very small, very vulnerable place with young
Hmm.
people, but which was able to gain traction and the support of all countries everywhere. And I will say that there was a lot of coordination and collaboration happening amongst small island developing states regions. So even though this was seen very much as a Vanuatu and then as a Pacific initiative, there was a lot of outreach and knowledge sharing and mutual capacity building happening across the Pacific and the Caribbean. And there was a full endorsement given by CARICOM heads of delegation for this process on the road to where we are now. And that was also extremely important to have.
Right. And so all of this landed us in a place where, and I wrote about it in the editorial of my most recent monthly report. And I just want to read some of the key elements that I pulled out here. And of course, you're here to correct me if I've misinterpreted or misstated anything. But I just want to give a little bit of a summary. One of the things that struck me the most is that basically the ICJ said that all states have an obligation to adopt measures to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, to adapt to
Hmm.
climate change, and to cooperate with each other to achieve the underlying objective of the UN Climate Change Convention, which is in essence preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system. To me, that was significant. Also, all states have obligations under international human rights law to respect and ensure the effective enjoyment of human rights by taking necessary measures to protect the climate system and other parts of the environment.
Hmm.
Um, the third thing I want to say is it said here that all states have a duty to prevent significant harm to the environment by acting with due diligence and to use all means at their disposal to prevent activities carried out within their jurisdiction or control from causing
Hmm.
significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment. In accordance with these countries' common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So I just want to highlight those three things. We all have obligations to mitigate and to adapt to climate change.
Hmm.
We have obligations to cooperate each with each other in good faith to achieve the underlying objective of preventing dangerous human interference. It is now an obligation under international human rights law to do these things, and also that different countries have common but differentiated responsibilities, meaning that, we say in Trinidad, Gopal luck is not Sipol luck, right? So, similar principle. What you can afford to do and what is within your capacity to do as a, let's say, a large developed country is not the same as a country like Vanuatu or
Mhm.
another Caribbean country. Those three things for me really stood out. And I just want to ask you, what were the things that struck you the most, and tell me how you feel about the outcome.
Yes, thanks for that, Mala. I think those three issues that you pulled out are very much at the core of the opinion that the judges have delivered. But maybe I'll pull it back a little bit just for the audience so that we could consider what the
Hmm.
questions were. What were the questions that were posed to the
Oh, yeah,
court
yeah, yeah, for
that
sure.
would have
I put,
resulted in this
I
type
went
of
and bypassed that
response?
very important step. So yes, thanks for pulling me back.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. But yeah, the questions for my response, I think the questions provide important context. So the
Hmm.
court was essentially asked, having regard to a range of different sources of international law, including the Charter, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Paris Agreement, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention of the Law of Sea, Declaration of Human Rights, etc., etc., general principles of international law. With regard to all of these different sources of international law, firstly, what are the obligations of states under
Hmm.
international law to ensure protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from man made emissions of greenhouse gases for present and future generations? Secondly, what are the legal consequences under these obligations for states where, by their acts and omissions, have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment? And the court was asked the second question around consequences, particularly with respect to um, other states, including in particular small island developing states, as well as people and individuals of present and future generations that are adversely affected by the impacts of climate change. So
Hmm.
it's a multifaceted
Yeah,
question,
it's
but
big. Yeah.
yeah, but it
Hmm.
boils down essentially to what are these obligations? What are the sources of law? Where can they be found? And how do we understand these obligations with regard to special groups such as small island developing states, present and future generations that may be adversely affected? And I think the court's opinion, at least what was important for me, is the extent to which they delved deeply into the current status um, of the law on this issue. So,
Hmm.
in the written and oral arguments before the court, you had a number of developed countries essentially arguing, and others essentially arguing that the Paris Agreement, UN Framework Convention climate regime is a closed system. And so, what that means is that if you are looking to understand what are states' obligations in relation to the duty to take action on climate change, they can be found there and there alone.
Hmm.
Now, those systems contain, including a lot of the principles that you've outlined, common but differentiated responsibilities in the light of national circumstances. Um,
Hmm.
they contain very, very key principles that have guided the actions of states in cooperating to address climate change for the last 30 plus years.
Wow.
But that regime shies away from establishing um, establishing ideas or routes or pathways that support liability and compensation, right? So
Mm.
those two key concepts have sort of deliberately been left outside the scope of that system. Um,
Meaning
it's
liability
also
and
with
compensation has been left
liability
out.
and compensation has been
Right.
left out. So that's one thing. The second thing is that because even though the UN Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol that followed it, and now the Paris Agreement are legally binding instruments, they're treaty texts or conventions. Um, the Paris Agreement, in particular, is what we call a bit of a hybrid because it contains both top down, legally binding elements, as well as bottom up, um, politically persuasive language, which isn't necessarily legally
Legally
enforceable,
binding. Okay.
right?
Okay.
So the Paris Agreement is in itself a hybrid. I mean, many international treaties are, they contain sort of a mix of obligations. So you have obligations where parties shall do something, which are normally understood as legally binding, but then you may have obligations where parties could, may, or should do something, which are less clear.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in the advisory opinion, what we see is, at least for me, first and foremost, an authoritative statement by the world's highest court clarifying exactly what the obligations of states are as it relates to climate action, drawing heavily on what is already contained in UN Framework Convention, Kyoto Protocol, and Paris Agreement regime, but also drawing on other relevant treaties, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, for example, human rights obligations, as well as general principles of international law to further clarify the gravity of these obligations, heavily as well relying on the science of climate change and the urgency of addressing the issue. It is an authoritative statement that I think should, we'll see, put to rest many of the arguments that are often led in the political discussion about who should be doing what, whose responsibility is it anyway, and what really is the level of ambition and how much discretion do we have as parties. So that to me that to me is really key, and those are the kind of headline messages that you pulled out, Marla, around the duty to mitigate, the duty to adapt, and the duty to cooperate. States do not just have a duty to mitigate, they have a duty to mitigate to a standard that will allow us to achieve the goals that are set out in the Paris Agreement, including the goal to keep long-term temperature increase within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And
Mm-hmm.
there's been a lot of back and forth because the Paris Agreement references both 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. There are some countries who have a political preference for the 2-degree limit because they see that as
Mm.
inherently more achievable and
Mm-hmm.
less potentially damaging to their economic interests. Um, the
But
court
but
has
but
also,
but it could be indirectly damaging because if we get to 2 degrees,
certainly,
then yeah.
certainly,
Mm-hmm.
certainly, but
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a game of short-term gain
Yes.
over long-term
Long-term interests.
benefit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
interests, and it becomes a game of assessing how much loss can be absorbed as opposed to how much profit does not need to be foregone.
Right.
So um, the court has now said decisively that the relevant temperature limit in the Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees Celsius.
And we
And
will stay
so,
with 1.5.
well, that at least as the level of ambition that we should be aiming for
Right.
globally, it is highly significant because even if eventually we end up in the land of overshoot, the understanding that this is the only acceptable limit should form the basis for um, the imperative to act to bring it down as soon as possible and as quickly as possible if we end up in the land of overshoot. And without that, there's a lot less motivation to act. So, those two things stand out very much for me, the authoritative statement on what the obligations are
Mm-hmm.
and the statement on what the level of ambition is that we need to be aiming for. Because the court then looks at what is the standard or duty of care that states need to have in carrying out these obligations that exist both within and outside of the climate regime. And they say that that standard or duty of care that needs to be applied is a stringent one. And that is because of the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, because only a stringent standard will get us there,
Mm-hmm.
consistently applied. Now, there is some qualification in the context of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of national circumstances, which is the full
Mm-hmm.
principle as elaborated in the Paris Agreement. But even in the application of that principle, the court does not shy away from saying that these obligations are shared by each state individually, especially as it relates to the obligation to take domestic mitigation measures. These are individual obligations as set out in the Paris Agreement. And the application of the duty of care is to be measured taking into account that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities with respect and respective capabilities in the light of national circumstances. So there is to some degree an expectation that in order to see how this operates in practice, it will be on a case by case basis.
Mm-hmm.
But as it is with all all law, the application of every legal principle, more or less, is usually subject to that type of consideration. So
Case
maybe I'll
by
pause
case.
there. Yeah.
Yes. Now, from a practical standpoint, we know we
Hmm.
have planetary boundaries that we have to respect, and the opinion made reference to planetary boundaries. Um, and we have a situation in the developing world, or the global south, as we're called, which, by the way, the global south is 80 something percent of the of the UN, basically of all states,
I
right?
always
We
wonder
dominate.
about that term, south in relation to what exactly?
Well, most
Where
of
is it?
us are south of the north, but
South of the equator?
yes, except for, like, Australia and New Zealand and so on. But
It is
I actually
arbitrary.
prefer, it is not geographically, there's some, but I prefer that term versus developing. And I so hate the
Mm.
term third world. Like, come on, you know. So of all the terms, I feel like the global south is,
The
I
global
suppose,
majority.
the global majority for sure. Let's call us that, the global majority. Let's go with that one. Good, Ruanna. So what I was getting at was, so we have planetary boundaries, and
Yes.
we have the global majority of countries that are in a situation where they have development needs. What do I mean by that?
Hmm.
Where, for example, in Guyana, people come down on Guyana now for drilling its oil, and but Guyana will soon get to 1 million barrels a day. And what is that going to do to the planet? Hang on, isn't Guyana and all the Guyanese people now and future generations, aren't they just as entitled to live lives with a certain standard of living and a certain level of well-being, education and healthcare and infrastructure that, let's just say, those in the UK or the US or Canada that were able to industrialize and develop many, many years ago, and without this constraint of planetary boundaries over their heads when it was their turn. And I think absolutely we are all entitled to a level of development and a level, however you define development. Now, so we have that consideration, right? That we have countries where you're trying to raise your literacy rate, you're trying to raise, the standard of education in your country, the standard of healthcare in your country. And so you have to respect these planetary boundaries as well as trying to achieve all of these things. We also have a situation where there is a very close, almost perfect correlation between energy use and GDP, um, or gross world product, GWP. Whereas we were told the energy intensity of GDP was declining, it's actually not declining. There are little fluctuations over time, but generally there's a very tight correlation. What does that mean? It means if these countries that want to develop, um, like I just mentioned, they're going to have to use energy, right? To lift their GDP and to lift their people out of poverty and underdevelopment. This opinion talks about respecting these limits, this 1.5 and planetary boundaries and so on. But the point I wanted to argue or want to discuss with you is how do you feel about the practical implications of a country like Guyana, even like Trinidad and Tobago, where we are from? I don't know if you saw a couple of days ago that our government signed a deal with Exxon where they gave them this very big, I think it was the amalgamation of 7 blocks, but a very big block offshore of ultra deep water. They give them rights for ultra deep water exploration. I think it's over 2 kilometers deep, this water, about 2.5 kilometers deep, which is deeper than Guyana. But they expect that they will find oil there and likely produce it. So the question I have and the issue that in my head, as an economist and somebody who regularly, advises governments and policymakers as well as the private sector, what do we do? How do you bring those two competing interests together? Development needs on one hand, planetary boundaries and 1.5 degrees on the other hand. Talk to me about what that means in a practical sense in terms of solving this problem, if you can.
I mean, this is always the $1 million question, right?
Of
I would
course.
tend to dispute that development means, or that there is this necessity for the use of fossil fuel energy in order to facilitate development. I would tend to dispute that
Great.
there is an inevitability that you cannot develop without over reliance on fossil fuel energy. Um,
Hmm.
I would dispute this on a range of bases, but one of the issues I think that I would raise is that and we've seen examples of this where it's not every resource rich country that decides to exploit these resources that
Absolutely.
has then been able to inevitably pull their people out of poverty, that has inevitably been able to guarantee their people, you know, a higher standard of living and guarantee their human rights.
Our country is a
right?
perfect example, right? We've been
So
exploiting oil and gas for over 100 years.
so
Yeah. So
so
our
so
country is a
so
perfect example.
I would dispute that it is there is a
Yep.
level of inevitability around that.
Agreed. Agreed. Agreed.
I would also say that there's so much to say. Um, there are many competing interests here naturally,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
temporally as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's short-term benefits of taking the well-traveled route. But I think those benefits are shrinking, and the shrinkage of those benefits will accelerate as we get deeper into the climate crisis.
Crisis.
Um,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
we
Mm-hmm.
are in a crisis at this time, even though
We are.
some refuse to recognize or accept that. We are
Mm-hmm.
deep in a climate crisis at this time. And so I would imagine that from that perspective, different choices need to be made, and different options need to be explored. But this is, I think,
100%. Mm-hmm.
separate from the question of, for example, the role that historical responsibility plays in understanding who needs to do what when. Um,
Agreed.
and it's separate, a bit separate from uh, issues around what we mean when we say differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of national circumstances, because national circumstances vary quite a bit. And
Yep.
even in the court's advisory opinion, they do speak to this question of um, the historical responsibility and what exactly, well, they mention it. I should say they don't go into great
It's
detail,
okay.
even though
Yeah.
one of the judges in a separate opinion does lament the fact that the court did not go into as much detail as they should have in
Mm-hmm.
configuring how exactly we are to take these issues into account and how exactly we are to interpret the application of the common but differentiated responsibilities with respective capabilities as a principle.
Let me just
Yes, you have a
interrupt
question.
you there, please. What I want to do is I just want to read an excerpt that gives an idea of what this historical obligation looks like. So, data from the Global Carbon Project illustrates that between 1750 and 2021, the global north accounted for, or the global minority, given what we just discussed in terms of terminology, accounted for over 70%, 70% of cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. According to the Lancet, as of 2015, the USA was responsible for 40% of excess global carbon emissions. The European Union was responsible for 29%. The G8 nations, which is the USA, and the EU, Russia, Japan, Canada, were together responsible for 85% of excess global carbon emissions. Countries classified by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as Annex 1 nations, which is the most industrialized nations, were responsible for 90% of excess emissions, and the global north itself was responsible for 92%. So, in other words, us in the global south, we are 8%. Right? Just to
Yes.
give a sense of the stark distinction between that historical obligation.
Yeah, so historical responsibility is there and it's relevant. Even in the Paris Agreement, it speaks to certain countries taking the lead, especially as it relates to issues of mitigation. And whereas we've seen some countries, particularly in the European Union, try to step up in
Mm-hmm.
this way, certainly that has not been uniform across the board in looking at countries that we would normally classify as developed. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, as is very evident right now, we have some very large neighbors who actually have been going completely in the opposite direction.
Opposite direction,
Um,
yes. So just for context, the EU, for example, is aiming to be net zero by 2050, um, whereas the US has, I guess, abandoned that road completely.
right. So,
Mhm.
so the lay of the land is complex,
Yes,
and I think so there is scope to say that countries with more responsibility need to move further, faster, and there is scope for political pressure to continue to build in order to get that response,
yes,
right? At the same time, though, the 1.5 degrees as a limit is actually a physical limit. It's a hard limit. It's not
mm-hmm.
an elastic one,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Even in the very high likelihood now of some overshoot, every additional fraction of a degree of warming will unleash more and more serious and deadly impacts. It
Yeah,
is a one to one,
yeah,
and it is not um, something that, you know, this is the science. This is a hard limit.
yeah.
And in addition to that, the longer we live in the land of overshoot, even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit is not a safe one. It is not a safe one,
It's
right?
a limit.
It's
It's the
it's a
outer limit.
limit. It's the
Mm-hmm.
outer limit. It is the
Maximum.
guardrail.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, the maximum
Mm-hmm.
guardrail that we think we can still continue to preserve life on the planet with, that we think we can still have people that live in very vulnerable places be able to carry out their lives with dignity. Human dignity can be guaranteed, that civilizations that are thousands of years old in the Pacific will not be forced to relocate, right? That
Yes.
is what 1.5 is. And
Not just in
so,
the Pacific, right here in the Caribbean.
no,
I
well,
don't know
of
if you
course.
know, but in the Cayman Islands, their highest point is their landfill.
Yeah, yeah, of
The Cayman
course, of
Islands
course.
would be flat, would be underwater just as much as the Pacific. So yeah,
Sea
it's
level
real
rise
there.
is a
Hmm.
reality. But
Absolutely.
when I mentioned the Pacific, I was speaking more in terms of civilizations and the actual societies that have lived in those areas for such a long time,
Thousands
with
of
their own
years. Yeah.
distinct, yes, with their own
Yeah.
distinct cultures and all of these
Hmm.
things that are tied to the land. It's tied
And
to
to
the
the
land.
sea. Hmm.
Exactly, who
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
want to leave, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So it's sea level rise is a threat, and it's increasingly immediate. So in that context, it's, I think, really urgent and incumbent on us in Trinidad and Tobago, throughout the region, in any vulnerable developing country, to have the difficult conversation to weigh the idea of short term development gains against medium to long term destruction.
Survival. Or
It's,
survival. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that that reckoning and that level of conversation is happening. There is no amount of money, there is no amount of money in the world that will be able to save our societies beyond, if we end up in the land of high overshoot beyond
Yeah.
1.5 degrees Celsius, right? If we end up in a high overshoot scenario, 1.7, 1.8, 2 degrees is unacceptable. So those conversations really need to start happening, and I'm not sure that they are. One, and two, it's very clear now from the advisory opinion that human rights have an important role to play.
Absolutely.
And civil and political rights, economic and social rights. And human rights have now, especially the human right to a healthy environment, has now been integrated into this conversation. There's one particular judge in their separate declaration who is lamenting that the scope and application of the right to a healthy environment wasn't fully expanded upon in
Hmm.
the consensus opinion, but enough was said to make it clear that regardless of historical responsibility or contribution to the overall problem, when it comes to duties and responsibilities of a state to their own people from a human rights point of view, there is no shield in place for them
Hmm.
as it relates
Hmm.
to that. And I think that also needs to be considered, especially when you think about the fact that the court has said that there are acts and omissions by states that can constitute internationally wrongful acts as it relates to how we understand whether or not they're meeting their obligations to address climate change. And they've included as a potentially wrongful act, as a potentially wrongful act, um, fossil fuel subsidies as a
Right.
potentially internationally wrongful act because of how much it can undermine the global effort to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, as much as historical responsibility is highly relevant and still important, and an important principle that needs to be applied to push countries that are more advanced, that, have better credit ratings or will get billion-dollar loans in spite of their credit ratings, to go further much faster. Um, that really does not act as a shield for the legal responsibilities of every country, even those that are small and vulnerable.
So, two things you mentioned there that I want to pick up on. You talked about fossil fuel subsidies, and as you know, in Trinidad and Tobago,
Hmm.
our electricity is subsidized,
Hmm.
which of course is natural gas, mostly natural gas generated. So that's something our government is going to have to think about.
Hmm.
Now, you mentioned as well, there is no amount of money if we overshoot 1.5, there's no amount of money that will save the planet. But I just want to share with the audience that when you think about this 1.5 and what does it mean, and you juxtapose that against the development needs, as I discussed earlier, that we all have the right to develop and to live a certain standard of living and well being, what does that mean? Now, the UN has calculated that we need an additional 1.8 trillion US dollars annually to address the climate crisis, and um, we also need 1.2 trillion US dollars annually to achieve the sustainable development goals. So
Yes,
that's roughly 4 trillion, right? That I saw somewhere else, the UN said we need to see this 4 trillion US dollars a year, not as in an inachievable number, because
hmm,
according to the Tax Justice Network, for example, in 2022, global military spending reached 2.2 trillion. And to your point earlier about fossil fuel subsidies, in 2022, fossil fuel subsidies totaled 7 trillion.
yep,
So this 4 trillion additional that we need every year to address the climate crisis and keep us within 1.5, but also as well as to achieve sustainable development goals, which by the way is for everybody, not just the global south. We just need
exactly,
4 trillion, right? So it is not by any means unachievable if we would stop spending 7 trillion every year on fuel subsidies, and if we will stop spending 2 to 3 trillion a year on war, basically. So it is absolutely achievable.
It is, and I'm happy that you provided that additional context, because one of the refrains that I've heard often in this work, is that, especially in the early days, when small island developing states came forward to say that a 2-degree long-term temperature goal was too much, and that in fact the goal should be set at 1.5 degrees Celsius, they were met with disdain, um, laughed out of the room,
Hmm.
told that they were being unrealistic,
And
and that
unreasonable.
and unreasonable, and that ask, that request would destroy the global economy. Right? That was the refrain. That was the refrain. Um,
Yeah.
and some countries still like to try to bring up those lines of argument. But I want to read something directly from the advisory opinion on
Yes,
fossil
please.
fuels in particular. As the court
Hmm.
says that the failure of a state to take appropriate action to protect the climate system from greenhouse gas emissions, including through fossil fuel production, fossil fuel consumption, the granting of fossil fuel exploration licenses, or the provision of fossil fuel subsidies, may constitute an internationally wrongful act, which is attributable to that state. Now, may constitute. So
Me.
it means that whether or not that is the case would be something to be decided on the facts of the individual case. So for some countries, um, that do not have other options or do not have the money, especially countries that have to import energy, right?
Yeah.
Um, and have not been able to attract the level of investment needed to significantly develop renewable sources of energy, so that they could decrease those importation bills. There may be good reasons why there are subsidies in place. There may be good reasons why some countries um, are taking this route, but certainly it would not be applicable to all.
Hmm.
And certainly, even if we think about historical responsibility, yes, we can say with some degree of certainty um, that it was the industrialization that took place in the 1900s, the early 1900s, late 1800s, that landed us in the position that we're in now. But time does not stand still.
Yeah.
And the marker for historical responsibility inevitably must shift eventually.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, the question would be, with this clarification of the type of activity that could constitute an internationally wrongful act, why should any state, in weighing its um, options for development, err on the side of potential liability?
Well, and I think Trinidad and Tobago definitely, given that it's what 100 and what 10 or 15 years that we've been exporting oil and gas, certainly we would be one of those small island developing states faced with this question, right? Even if we've not been independent for all that time, so some of that could be attributable to, say, the UK when we were a British colony. It's still a question we would have to face.
Yeah, time does not stand still. And so, historical responsibility is a shield with many holes in it, that eventually is expected to disintegrate. Um, but perhaps before that happens, there would be so much inundation happening as a result of sea level rise, as a result of the disappearance of coral reefs, which provide such an essential barrier for coastlines from, wave action and sea level rise in particular. Um, that maybe the question will become a moot point, because at that stage, I
Everybody will
guess,
have to take action.
well, one would hope, but I mean, Mala, to be honest, like we are in those dire circumstances
Yeah.
now, and the the sluggishness in the response, um, the way that interests aren't being properly weighed. It continues to surprise me. It continues to surprise me. I ask myself the question: what more needs to happen? How many more need to suffer? I don't know.
Well, I think we can take comfort that at least we have this opinion now, right? And it's been a long road, but we're here. So I feel like that's still good progress, and we have this document, this opinion that provides, as we've been discussing, all kinds of good progress on this front. I want to wrap up the conversation. So I would like to ask you to tell us, from your opinion, in your opinion, for countries like ours, in Trinidad and Tobago and others in the Caribbean, what next? What do we need to be doing?
There's so much that has already been done
Mm-hmm.
that needs to be taken further.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the region, um, there's been very many assessments on the feasibility of different types of renewable energy and different approaches. In some islands, that has now been transformed into a very, very ambitious short-term goals around renewable energy expansion. So they've
Mm-hmm.
gone beyond policy and they're now into implementation. I think Trinidad and Tobago still has a lot of ground to cover there. Um, Also with so much potential if you think about hydrogen, green hydrogen, and the role that that could play. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot that still has to happen in the context of adaptation, in the context of simply preparing our people to be able to deal with what we're now faced with, and that requires um, lots of education, but also lots of capital as well to protect critical infrastructure, um, to perhaps internally even relocate um, infrastructure, people that are living in areas that are very, very much under threat already, and those areas do exist in
Yep.
our islands. So I feel as though the government has certainly begun the process. Um, for some of this, there is a national adaptation plan in place, for example, but implementation is what is needed. So I would say the what now the what now would be to take the steps that need to be taken to put policy into action,
Mm-hmm.
because we do have a lot of policy in place. And we recently had the approval of the new climate change policy. It needed updating. It's been updated. Um, so there's work to be done to actually put existing policy into action, and there's work to be done to to catch up with where the rest of the world is now, because renewable energy costs have been dropping, and dropping and dropping and dropping drastically over the past few years, to the point where in some instances they're even competitive with coal, which is the cheapest form of fossil fuel energy. And there really is very little reason why we should not also be riding that wave, especially when there is so much to gain, for many of our industries here, thinking about the application of carbon border adjustment measures, for example. I know this is
Right.
something you've spoken about and talk a lot about. Um, but yeah, there is opportunity. It's not all it's not all Banya belt
Yeah. No. No. No.
stringency.
No.
There is so much opportunity in this space,
Absolutely.
that I think we need to do a better job of recognizing and taking advantage of.
Agreed. Agreed. And the private sector certainly has, I think, is increasingly awake to these opportunities in the Caribbean, thankfully. Ruana, I cannot thank you enough for your time and for sharing your expertise. and for patiently explaining things. I always say to people, explain to me like I'm an 8-year old, because that's, the reality of those of us who are not experts in this field. That's how we need it. And I really appreciate that you've taken the time and you've explained this so well. And I really hope to have you back. I last heard you speak, like I said, about 6 years ago. Hopefully, in the next 5, 6 years, you and I will be having a much different conversation talking about how much progress we've made, right?
I hope so. Thanks so
Um,
much, Mana. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. And looking forward to having that conversation with you in the next few years and talking about all the progress we've made. Thanks again. So, thank you all for paying attention. And we've had an amazing discussion with Miss Ruano Haynes, who's, by the way, also Trinidadian. And in terms of just summarizing what we've been discussing, of course, Ruana outlined for us the main findings in this landmark case at the ICJ, the world's highest court. And what is very important about this particular ruling that the ICJ made. It's the first time that any court, let alone the world's highest court, has decided that countries have specific obligations as it relates to the planet and as it relates to the climate crisis. And in trying to make sure that as we go forward, all of our policies and the way that we manage our economies do so with planetary boundaries in mind, especially the fact that the ICJ found, which is this is a very important element of their findings, that all states have responsibilities. We have joint and shared responsibilities, but we have differentiated obligations. In other words, different states have different obligations. So, small island developing states, for example, who actually are not the world's largest contributors to carbon in the atmosphere and therefore to the climate crisis, we have a different level of responsibility than those larger countries that have demonstrated, we can demonstrate with the data that they've contributed to the carbon in the atmosphere. So these are very important points to note. I think the call to action that I would want to share with you is to ask your government, what is it that we're doing towards adhering to the obligations that the ICJ has decided that each of us have as nation states? What is my country doing towards achieving the kind of development we want, the kind of policy agenda that's in place in your country, but within planetary boundaries and honoring these obligations and responsibilities that we have to the planet? Thank you for paying attention to our discussion, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.